Okay, well, we are just about live. I'm going to bring up our special, fantabulous Zoom background for Space Rocks Uplink, and we're going to bring Mark McCorcoran into the chat right now. Welcome, everybody, to Space Rocks Uplink, episode 37. How you doing, Mark? Welcome back to the show. It's we've had a little break, haven't we?
Indeed, we always promise to do it weekly, but sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way. So it's been a couple of weeks, I think, since. Who did we have on last? We had Fabiola and Tony, so from CERN and Eurofusion, I think, and that was fascinating. Some high energy physics there. And today, in a way, we're going to be talking about high energy physics again. Fascinating evening ahead of us, I think.
Indeed. Well, I mean, high energy physics is one way of describing it. I guess we didn't want to get too poetic, but sometimes it sort of happens when you're doing Space Rocks Uplink or indeed anything that we're up to. The beauty and wonder of the night sky. I think that, we're as much about the science as we are about the human and cultural reactions that we have to these sorts of things. And I think, our two guests tonight are uniquely placed to kind of relate just what it's like to stand underneath that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this evening we have back, as I was just thinking about a phrase for her, she won't like it, the First Lady of Space Rocks, Beth Healey. So Beth was on stage, gave a talk at our first event in London in 2018, and was the first guest on Uplink just less than a year ago, last April. Beth is a medical doctor, an extreme environments doctor, so she has worked on expeditions in the very high latitudes in the North Pole, Siberia and Greenland. But her connection to ESA is that she was the winter over doctor at the Franco-Italian Concordia station in the very high Antarctic plateau, so spent a year there in Antarctica as the doctor at the Concordia base. So it's great to have her back, and of course she's been through an interesting year in her professional life as well, so we'll talk about that. We all know what's happened in the last 12 months, and Beth has had a sort of a unenviable front row seat, let's say, in that regard.
Indeed. Well, it's going to be an interesting hour or so. I guess without further ado.
Yes, except we haven't actually introduced the other guest yet. So,
okay. Well, let's jump on to Sævar.
Indeed. So what you see behind me here is the stark beauty of Iceland. This is a black and white photograph, although a lot of Iceland looks to be pretty much that color because, of course, it's relatively fresh lava. And Sævar Helgi Bragason, our other guest this evening, is an astronomer and science communicator living in Reykjavik, and works there communicating astronomy. And that might be the solar eclipse, which occurred in Iceland in, if I got it right, 2015. But also the night sky. So, of course, Iceland is famously under the northern lights, the aurora. And Sævar works as an astronomer working with the public and also working with tourists who come specifically to look at the night sky and the aurora in Iceland. And he's connected into lots of astronomy networks around the world as well that touch on ESA and other organizations. So he has another perspective, if you like, from the other end of the earth.
Indeed, the other end of the earth, and a unique part of the world as well. And I think, just as with all episodes of Uplink, I think we enjoy being transported to other places because I guess a lot of us don't actually get to do that right now. Right. So without further ado, we'll bring Beth and Sævar in to the conversation. Okay, we have a number one and a number two. Sævar and Beth, how are you?
Hello. Sorry.
So Beth is on the equator at the moment.
Sorry, am I wonky? I just dropped my phone. Sorry.
You are. Yeah. Well, you probably need to rotate it and rotate it back again, I'm going to imagine.
Okay, sorry.
It's all right. So whilst you're faffing around, no, you're still sideways, Beth.
Am I still sideways?
There you go.
Sorry.
That's all right. This is why we do this is why we do the technical check, right?
Yeah, I literally, it was in the perfect position that I just jumped back on the sofa and then I fell down again. Sorry. Okay.
So
It's all good. Welcome both. It's such a pleasure to have you here. And I guess as Mark had been intimating just a minute ago, Beth, it's a special one, a bit of a family reunion for another reason, because actually you are our very first guest on Space Rocks Uplink, and that's pretty special. I suppose just to kind of kick things off. I mean, sorry, my cat's now getting involved. So just to kick things off a little bit, you know, I mean, so you've had quite the year, you know, since we last caught up with you and talked about the experience of isolation and what that can teach us.
Yeah, right. I mean, who knew all these months? I mean, it was almost a year ago, wasn't it, that we had our conversation, that all of this was going to happen. And I mean, of course, we were at the beginning of the pandemic at that point, but I don't think any of us sort of anticipated quite the impact that it was going to have on all of our lives.
So at that point, you were in well, I don't want to say Chamonix. You weren't in Chamonix at that point, but you were in. Yeah.
No, I was living in Chamonix, but working in Martinique.
That's right. But now you're back in the UK. You moved back fairly soon after that, and have been working in hospital in the ICUs. Again, we talked about this beforehand, and I think it's, you know, okay, you know, what's it really been like? Because the rest of us, frankly, have been sitting at home, sort of, you know, well, mostly, right? I mean, trying to stay away from it, but you've been right there in the front line. Give us a bit of a feel for that. No, it's not what tonight's about, but you've had a harder year than many of us. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, hard and not hard. I think I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to also have not been isolated in the same way as a lot of people have done. And so it's been a very different year for me than anything I've ever experienced before. You know, I'm sort of used to working out in the Alps and mainly sort of dealing with like ski injuries and things like that. So infectious diseases is pretty alien to me, and also intensive care as well. So it's been like a new speciality, back in a new country, because I've not really done much work in the UK before. So, and I felt, you know, really supported by all of the team. And I think that's the thing for a lot of people, you know, it's a new disease, it's something that we're not used to working with, and we're having to adapt the way that we're working to deal with it as well. So we've all sort of been jumping in at the deep end. But also with that also brings a lot of camaraderie, and I've been working in Bath up until this week, in fact, and it's just been an amazing department. Everyone's been so friendly and sort of teaching us all how to do it, how to don and doff and wear all the new equipment and things, and just sort of dealing with that sort of new experience as well. So, you know, there's been very hard times and very good times as well. And I feel really lucky to have sort of had that experience with the team that I have done.
Excellent.
Well, I think that you know, we all salute the work that you've been doing, you know, certainly, and you know, fully appreciate that. You know, it has been, you know, quite the year, I suppose, for all of us, which is why tonight I think is a really lovely topic, because it's one that's going to take us all somewhere else a little bit, you know. And so, Sævar, I turn to you, you know, and you've probably heard this from a lot of people, a lot like me. I've had the privilege of being to Iceland, seeing the beauty and what feels otherworldly, but is actually completely worldly. I suppose, just as with Beth's extraordinary experiences, is probably one of the more accessible but unusual places for most of us to go and visit. I mean, and you do some work in that field, dealing with people like me who are just basically up there to kind of go, wow, for a week or so.
Yes, every now and then I actually take tourists out to see the stars mostly, but they usually want to see the Northern Lights itself, which don't often or don't always present themselves. But it's always lovely to just travel around with people from other countries and seeing my own country with their eyes. You start to appreciate it more even, and see things differently than before.
So explain to us, you know, for the sake of the audience, you know, we know of the Northern Lights, and of course, and we'll come back to Beth, and you know, they're there in the south as well. Mm-hmm. Why don't we see them all the time, or why do we see them in some places rather than the other? Why is Iceland lucky to be where it is? In fact, has a pretty high occurrence of it. You don't see it typically at lower latitudes.
All right.
What are they to begin with? How do they even form?
All right. So I presume most people know that the Northern Lights, or maybe are familiar with it. The Northern Lights are formed when particles from the sun, charged particles, mostly electrons, collide with the Earth's atmosphere. So it's the solar wind interacting with the upper atmosphere of the Earth, causing it to glow, basically. And in this sort of a belt or a zone, which Iceland happens to be just below, that's usually the best places in the world to see the Northern Lights. So Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Alaska, Canada, some parts of northern Canada and Russia, of course, are excellent places in the Northern Hemisphere to see it. But there are few people living in a similar area in the Southern Hemisphere, and maybe just the penguins get to enjoy the show of the aurora australis every now and then. But occasionally we have some storms coming from the sun, which means that the particles are more energetic, and that means that the aurora belt itself slowly just goes a little bit further south. It widens up and goes a little bit further south or north in the case of you being in the Southern Hemisphere. But the sun is always sending a solar wind, of course, but it's sometimes quite, it's moving a little bit slowly sometimes, but faster at other times, which means that the activity sort of varies. So if the solar wind is traveling really fast, we have higher energy particles colliding with the Earth. That means that we can see more dynamic and more colorful northern lights. And usually when the sun is quite active, it means maybe 2, 3, 4 times a week or so. But nowadays it's maybe 2, 3, 4 times a month.
Okay, so just to, this is linked, of course, to the Earth's magnetic poles.
Yes.
That's why you don't see it lower down, because the magnetic field repels the electrons lower down, but they're funneled into this zone.
Exactly.
But when you say it's at different times of the year, so what a lot of people think is let's just go in the middle of winter, but that's not the best time to see the aurora, right?
That's exactly right. So many people think that you should come during the darkest time of the year, like December and January. But when you look at the data, it shows you that the northern lights actually love the equinoxes. So the best time is usually March, April, or September, October to actually come and visit to see the northern lights, because on average, you are about twice as likely to see the northern lights by then than around the solstice. And of course, in the summer solstice, you don't see anything because it's bright 24/7 in these latitudes. So by all means, visit the country in preferably September, because the roads are still open and you can pretty much drive around wherever you want and chase the holes in the clouds, because that's usually how you need to see them. You need to chase the holes in the clouds.
My brother is an airline pilot and frequently flies across the Atlantic, and he told me some years ago, he says, you know what, I have never seen Iceland once in my life. It's always been under the clouds. Yeah, that's not quite fair, but
it's usually cloudy. Yeah, it's actually quite cloudy. I guess that comes from being an island in the middle of the Atlantic. So we get most of the low pressure system coming from the south up to our region, and quite frankly, it's quite wet and windy place. But fortunately, there aren't that many people living here, so it's quite easy to go out, light pollution, and see very pristine and beautiful sky and enjoy the northern lights.
So, Beth, let me pick up before I hand back to Alex. Concordia, if I'm right, actually is almost in the middle of the hole. So the auroral belt in the south doesn't go to Concordia very often. But have you seen the aurora australis, the southern lights?
Yeah, I certainly
You were
did.
there a whole year, right? So
yeah, it would have been very disappointing not to. No, we were really lucky. So we actually had quite a lot of aurora for sort of, as you say, for our position in Antarctica. We're not positioned in the best place. I've been fortunate enough to go up to Greenland a few times and having seen the northern lights as well, which are just stunning. But I really remember, I think the thing that's really caught me about the southern lights is the fact that we hadn't seen anyone or anything for so long that I just remember when the lights came, it was almost like, I don't know, it was just as though something had come to visit us. It was a really strange sensation. And we're and it was actually the first time I'd ever seen it was when I was in Antarctica. But the thing is, you can't see them through the window, and we were at sort of minus 80 degrees centigrade. So you had to rely on the fact that somebody would be outside at the time of the aurora. And whenever there was, they would call up on the radio, and then there'd be a big alarm going off on the base. And then everyone would run outside with their cameras to go and sort of capture the moment and to experience it. And I remember once I was watching Game of Thrones, and I was literally wearing, because actually at Concordia it's really hot inside, so I was wearing flip-flops, shorts and a t-shirt probably, and then I sort of just jump into my big polo suit, but normally I put a million layers underneath, and then I just got carried away with taking pictures of this beautiful aurora, and we went further and further away from the station. That was the only time that I actually got really properly cold, and I had to be sort of helped back into the station because I couldn't sort of open doors on my own. So you have to be careful, because I think that was the thing for a lot of us. We all got carried away with with the excitement of seeing it. But it was really beautiful, just like lots of like pinky ones, as well as the green sort of more traditional ones that you're used to seeing.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I guess this is something that kind of like touches on something that makes it so fascinating, because of course, being human, we don't look at these things and just say, wow, what a stimulating scientific phenomenon. I mean, you know, these are sights that, you know, I suppose like so much about the night sky, they don't just inspire, you know, awe, but also, you know, just like historically, they've inspired mythology, you know, all kinds, you know, of, you know, belief systems, you know, and notions about what's out there, because I guess there is something that is so striking and so visceral. And it's just so, I guess, interesting that we're speaking with two people who haven't just experienced it, you know, in, I guess, because they've witnessed it firsthand, but also because they witnessed it in landscapes that I think, you know, just are very, very otherworldly. Now, I mean, Beth, I mean, people talk about Antarctica as, you know, the white Mars, right? You know, I mean, just, you know, for a very stunning reason, because it really must have just been like being on another planet, in another world.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a sort of incredible experience. And as you say, like, it's just like the colors that you would see, even not even just with the aurora, but sort of, we had like a period between the 24-hour daylight and the 24-hour darkness. And the whole time during that sort of couple of months, it would literally just be like a really pinky purple sort of color at the sky. And you could see like the shadow of the earth as well at the horizon. It was just insane, like the colors that you would see. And just like, so we had the long polar night, so which for us, where we were, was 105 days where we didn't see the sunlight at all during that period. And it really was amazing to see. We could see like the Milky Way all the time, and we could see all the different planets at various points. So we were really lucky to have an astronomer with us on the base as well. So he was able to sort of point out things and also help to predict when we might be more or less likely to see auroras and things like that. So he certainly helped us sort of navigate the stars a little bit. But I must admit, before I'd gone down, I'd never really been much of sort of a stargazer or anything. And I was just like completely overwhelmed with seeing the night sky there. It was just incredible. But you could see the Milky Way when you're sort of finished your breakfast and went outside at sort of at brunch time or something, because it's just weird. It was a bit trippy, like having 24-hour nighttime as well.
Amazing.
So Iceland, of course, is just below the Arctic Circle. I'm not sure there's a part of Iceland which pokes above it, but nevertheless, it's close. And so for you, Sævar, you have that very strange change, which Beth had in a kind of, let's call it a research environment, but there's 350,000 people living in Iceland, right, who go from almost continuous daylight at one half of the year to almost continuous darkness at the other end. It must screw with your head completely, right? If not your body clock, there must be something deeply strange. I mean, I remember the first time I went there, you know, we arrived at some crazy time in the night at Keflavik and drove in and had to knock on somebody's door to get the key for the apartment we were renting. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning and they were just up having coffee and, you know, because it was daylight, right? And it was, you know.
Exactly. It messes with your circadian rhythm. I mean, we sleep less in the summer and we sleep a little bit more in the winter. In the winter, where I live in the south of Iceland, just very close to Reykjavik, we have about 4 hours of daylight, but not like a complete daylight, but then 20 hours or so of darkness. That's during the darkest part of the year. We see the sun mostly or almost 24/7 in June, which is kind of amazing because the sunsets are really long and the colors are really beautiful, sort of what Beth was actually trying to or explaining to us. So this light here is sometimes kind of otherworldly, I guess, but I guess the same goes with all the similar latitudes, of course. Yeah. But it's beautiful. I mean, whenever I look out here from my window, I can see, of course, the ocean, and the sun just barely dips below the mountains in the back. So it's quite beautiful, actually.
So this thing that Beth mentioned about, a lot of people don't realize this idea that when the sun has just set and if you have a clear horizon, a clear night, it's that purpley color which is in a band and then extends up into the sky. It's called the belt of Venus. This is actually the Earth casting a shadow onto its own atmosphere. And that, you know, for me, when I see that, and it's not so often, you often see it from aeroplanes, but, you know, if you have a nice clear horizon, you can see it on the ground as well. But it's just that, it's one of those weirdly sort of cosmic vertigo things that you suddenly think, I live on a ball, and it's casting a shadow into space through its own atmosphere.
Yeah, I had one of this nice experience when I was flying back to Iceland from, I think it was Germany, couple of years ago in December, and almost, well, when we got close to Iceland, I looked out the window and I could see the polar night easily from the window, because Iceland is so close to the Arctic Circle. It was quite, yeah, it was very beautiful to see it.
So you're saying I'm in daylight, but over there it's nighttime because there's a band.
Yes, exactly. It was beautiful.
Well, not to bring too much of my own experience into it, but I've been very lucky to see the aurora borealis. Weirdly, my first experience was while flying from London to Japan, and going over Russia, as you do, you just just a pilot came on and said, and if you're awake, just look over the left side, and and then suddenly you see it all. But the thing that I was immediately struck by, and I wonder what both of you think about this observation, was because the sky is such a constant, the night sky, the day sky, what it looks like and whatever else, when you see something alter that, what I was immediately struck by was just how fragile the Earth seemed to me, because it seemed impossible that, suddenly I was just possessed with this real acute awareness that we really are just a ball floating in space, and just that these incredible forces are kind of just whipping around us, and that was a really, kind of profound, experience. I mean, you've both been to places, that are from an environmental perspective, from an ecological perspective, extremely fragile environments, ones that invite our curiosity, but have to be carefully balanced against the drive for tourism, the drive for people to go and to see these things for themselves, right? I mean, Sævar, from your perspective, Iceland, has to have a restrictive policy toward people visiting, right? Because in a way, you don't want to ruin this beautiful crystalline environment.
Well, one would think, but we welcome as many people as possible. I guess that's partly greed. But there has been some discussion of actually limiting the number of tourists that can visit the country, although I don't think anyone is taking those ideas seriously. But we definitely need to control the areas much more than we actually do. It's free of charge to go wherever you want. You don't have to pay to see the waterfalls or anything like that. So basically, to protect the area, we just pay it from our own pocket, which means through taxes, because we like to keep the country open, as much open as possible. And whenever Icelanders are told that they would maybe have to pay to go visit some of their landmarks, they get all like they become like French people. Yeah, they just go out in the street and protest. We don't have to pay anything. Which is that in a way, yeah. But we definitely need to take more or better care of the country for sure, and we should definitely do that in any way we possibly can. There's been talk of actually making the whole the Highland of Iceland national park, but that has been met with heavy criticism, mostly from people who like to drive around or people who are hunters. So yeah, people are protesting those ideas.
So one thing that came to me when I was there with you in Iceland a few years ago was that because of the extensive geothermal energy that you have, and I'm not sure if that's actually a geothermal plant right behind you there, I guess it is. That I'm paraphrasing, but essentially electricity was free in Iceland until after the financial crash, 2008, 2009. Sort of two things happened. One, tourism became a big deal, encouraging tourists to come in. The other one was setting up the big aluminium smelters on the coast, bringing in the bauxite, using the cheap electricity, and then shipping it out again. So not actually making aluminium there, but just doing that one piece of the process. But that meant that you had to start paying for electricity. And this sounds like crazy things for those of us sort of at lower latitudes, right? Free electricity, free hot water for your jacuzzi, and the rest of it. But that's kind of changing, right? As the tourism increases. So you've seen those changes happen.
I have seen those changes, but still, electricity and hot water is definitely almost free. We pay hardly anything for it, and that's probably the reason why many Icelanders like to keep their lights on during the night, and then their radiators inside their houses, which are all we use geothermal water to actually heat our houses. And whenever we are warm, we don't turn down the radiators. We actually just open the window or the door, let the cold in. So that's basically what I do, because these things are so cheap. We have swimming pools all over the places and jacuzzis. And you can go there in the middle of the winter if it's -10. I mean, one of the things I've actually found out is that people often become interested in stargazing by going to their summer huts, which are all over the country. And in their summer huts, they have jacuzzis. So they're just sitting around in their jacuzzis in the middle of the night. It's -5, -10 degrees centigrade or something like that, drinking champagne or red wine or white wine or whatever. And they're looking up and seeing the sky without any light pollution whatsoever. So then they, for the first time, actually see pristine, beautiful, dark night sky above their heads, and they become interested in actually knowing about it. So we call this hot tub stargazing or jacuzzi stargazing.
I remember when we went there was a jacuzzi at the place we rented, and the instructions, it said, you thought how to keep it clean, because jacuzzis famously, right,
Yes.
not clean places, and it just said just empty the water out and fill it up again. And you're thinking, what a waste of hot water. It's like, it's free, it comes out of the ground. So Beth, let's come to you. So that you were
I love Iceland. I remember going to the Blue Lagoon and just like swimming around, getting a G&T, and but I do feel like it's a country where you are really in touch with nature as well. You just can't avoid being amazed by all of the volcanic materials and everything around, and you just really are sort of very much at one with nature. I think as a country, I think it's quite striking compared to maybe being in London or somewhere.
But let's go to Antarctica, back to Concordia, because there you have exactly the opposite problem, right?
Yeah.
Everything's limited. You're not going to.
We had a sauna. We did have a sauna.
But tell us a little bit about how people actually live there, because it's basically a couple of high-tech huts stuck on at 3,500 meters. Nobody comes in. There's no electrical grid. There's no geothermal power. How on earth do you actually run a base like that? I don't know in specific technical terms, but you can't just open the windows to let the cold air in, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, as you say, it's a funny paradox, because it's actually really hot inside, because for exactly that reason, we can't open the windows, because if you open the windows at -80 outside, it just ices up immediately and you'd never close it again. And that has happened. And we never got those ones closed. So you get into lots of trouble. So that was one of the big things. They went around and locked all the windows when we first went in. And it is a bit like, it's a bit like Mad Max. That I think we had 4 big generators, because we only needed one, but then they were like, well, we have one, and then we have the safety one, and then we have the extra one, and then we have the one if everything else fails. And it's just, but you do realize how reliant you are on all of this technology as well, because if four generators did fail, that would be it for us, because you just couldn't survive in those kind of temperatures without sort of man-made assistance, really. So you really did feel sort of a little bit vulnerable, I think, and we did lots of testing and training and things for in case things did go wrong, and it did make you realize just quite how vulnerable you were, I guess, right, being there, and just how remote you were. I mean, I did the Overland Traverse, which was driving the sort of big cat tractors back from the coast back to Concordia, and it took us 12 days of driving, and it was just like driving across the plateau, and you just literally. So there was quite a lot to see on the first day. Sort of drove through the penguins and drove up onto the ice sheet. But then after that, it was exactly the same for the next 12 days. And it really is just sort of a big flat expanse with a lot of sensory deprivation, really. And it really was, I think, because of that, made it all the more exciting to see the aurora, because I just remember, it sounds a bit crazy when I talk about it, but it was a little bit like someone had come to visit us, and I was like, oh, hey, little guy, just floating around there, because I guess the first one I saw, it wasn't really what I had expected. Sort of, I see you guys background, they're the big sort of exciting ones, and I have seen those as well, and they're just amazing. They sort of blow your mind with how much they move around the sky. But I just remember the first one I ever saw, it was just like this tiny little, it was like a little cloud that just hovered there, and we're just like, oh, hi. I mean, it was just like a weird experience, and I think that's the thing. I think the aurora has a character, because no one is the same, and they're all so different, and they have all different colors, and they have different intensities, and they all have their own personalities, and I think that's also what makes it so special, because no one will see the same aurora that you've experienced in that particular place. And I think I can really sort of it's like smells or music or something. You can remember those specific experiences that you've had, and the aurora that you've seen in that particular moment, and it's special because nobody else is ever going to sort of experience that particular moment again as well, which I think is kind of cool.
You're exactly right, because most of the time the auroras look like faint bands across the sky, without any sort of not something like this that you can see in my background. Those are just the pictures we like to publish, of course, whenever the auroras are active enough to produce these beautiful colors they actually produce. But most of the time they're just faint bands of light in the northern part of the sky, but sometimes they cover the whole sky, which is very annoying for those of us who'd like to see the stars that are hiding behind.
Oh, you can't be annoyed at an aurora,
Yeah, well,
surely.
As an excuse for myself, this is quite mundane for most of Icelanders. They say, oh, there are auroras in the sky. What else is new, basically?
Yeah.
But so for me, sometimes, yes, it's definitely natural light pollution, because I like to take my students out and observe the stars, or like observe some galaxies or clusters or nebulae and such. And sometimes it has actually happened quite often that I haven't been able to show them anything that they have actually been studying in school, because the auroras were completely blocking view. And then you curse the bloody auroras for blocking the view to the stars. But most of the time they're beautiful and nice to look at.
I'm definitely sure it's your fault, because I'm changed my background. This was the first day I met you. I arrived in Iceland. I had never seen the aurora before. We just drive along a road and there it is. It's like, come on, right? You have extra magnetism that pulls it in. It's
That's
you.
True.
I'm getting very envious of all the aurora backgrounds. I wish I could compare. Like, I've got a bay tree.
You're all good.
Nice.
It's always got to be always the branded background with me, so we're both of our hands are tied.
Well, yours is very cool, and I like the fact that Space Rocks is like the purple aurora. I think that's a bit niche.
Well, that's quite right. So let's pick up on that. I mean, I was going to hand back to Alex, but let's pick up. Sævar, tell us why it is that, mostly it's green, what you see behind me and what you see behind you. But Beth talked about seeing purple, and there's blues and there's reds. Why? Why is that different?
Different colors are produced by different molecules and atoms at different energy levels, basically. So the green color you see is mostly from ionized oxygen being roughly 100 kilometers high in the upper atmosphere. So when it ionizes, it produces or gives away or radiates away this greenish tint, because when atoms and molecules get excited, they release light. You can see reddish auroras above the green ones, and it's also produced by oxygen. And if you see red color below the green ones, it's produced by nitrogen. And sometimes the colors mix, and they can be sort of purple or violet even. And then they can be whitish, even a little bit grayish. So the different colors are basically just differently ionized molecules and atoms of nitrogen and oxygen.
Right. And they're not, something I sort of knew, but I had to look into recently. They're not unique to the Earth. They actually occur all over the solar system in different places. Even though we think we're the only planet with a kind of terrestrial planet with an atmosphere, there's atmospheres everywhere else. There's places to hit. So it's an interesting universal phenomenon.
Exactly. You can even see auroras appearing in the sky of Ganymede, the moon of Jupiter. So there are auroras. As long as you have atmosphere and magnetic field, you are pretty likely to see auroras.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though, because of course we talked a little bit about at the very beginning. It's not just the scientific phenomenon, of course. It's also just what the aurora, what the lights have meant over many millennia. I mean, it's funny to hear you describing the the mundane nature of it all to Icelanders now, given what it meant to them historically, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they once believed that it was the reflection of armor as Valkyries carried warriors to Valhalla, right? Because of course, 1,000 years ago, beyond, what would you have made of it all? How would you have explained all that? And so, of course, it's just an extraordinary sight, and I guess you had to have an extraordinary story to go with it. I wonder if we might just broach that for a minute before.
Yes, sure. There are many myths and legends, and you described one with the Valkyries. One is also, it's called the herring light, because it was light reflecting from fish, herring in the sky. Even fox blowing up dust using his tail, or actually snow in the sky that got reflected in the night. In Iceland, there are no myths, basically, but there are a few legends or folklores, maybe. And one of them goes that if a pregnant woman looks at the northern lights, the child she carries will become cross-eyed. So that's one of the folklores. Another one says that if a pregnant woman is, during labor actually, if she's giving birth and looks at the northern light, it's supposed to decrease pain during labor. But then, of course, you risk your child becoming cross-eyed. So I don't know the way risks there. But people have always tried to connect the northern lights with, of course, terrestrial weather. And many people think that you can only see the northern lights if the sky is, or if the temperature is really low, like it's freezing and it's quite still. But that's not the case. Here in the north, it just happens that you can only see the northern lights when it's dark enough, and that is actually during the winter time mostly. And whenever we see the northern lights here, we have strong northerly winds as well, because that's about the only time we have clear skies here in the southern part of Iceland. And those northerly winds come from the Arctic in the winter, which means that it's usually quite cold. So if you see stormy auroras, it was supposed to actually predict storms. But when we look at the data, there's no evidence of any of that. And the terrestrial weather has nothing to do with the northern lights, because everything is taking place much higher up, and it's of course the space weather itself, not the terrestrial weather.
Well, it's funny because I remember being in Iceland, and there were a lot of folk beliefs about what you need to do and everything if you wanted to catch them, right? Because you don't always do that. Now, I wanted to acknowledge that tonight we're not just joined by Sævar and Beth, of course. We have people joining us from all over the world, who are watching, and they have questions and so on. And this is a really great segue from Roman, who's got a question for Beth about, what can we learn about journeys to Mars, given your experience with isolated groups? And I guess, in both cases, both Iceland and your experiences, Beth, there is a lot that we can learn, just in the context of, how to live with limited resources, but also how people interact and what it does to human psychology and so on. And so I wondered if we could get into a little bit about what Concordia can teach us about these notions of long-term space travel.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's such a huge topic, but as you say, Concordia, the main reason that we're using it with the space agency is because it does simulate in many ways a mission to Mars in terms of the isolation of the crew and how that affects them both psychologically and physiologically. So we have lots of different what we call spaceflight analogues, which are sort of environments which in some way replicate different elements of spaceflight. And the good thing about Concordia is the isolation, and because obviously if you have sort of a medical problem or a problem up on the International Space Station where we are currently, we can evacuate the crew pretty quickly, but if we're going on these longer duration missions, that's not going to be possible. And I think, I mean, there's so much that we can learn, and that I think is useful for a Mars mission, but it's such a big topic. I'm not really sure where to start.
Let me probe you on the psychology part, because of course I think we talked about it last time, and we've talked to some of the other guests we've had in the meantime. For example, we had on Fred Hayes, who was one of the Apollo 13 astronauts, and he sort of said, well, frankly, it's just 3 days there and 3 days back. Of course, there was all the excitement with the fact that they didn't get to land on the moon and that. But we talked with him about how different it will be when you're kind of halfway to, let's say, Mars. You can't see the Earth. It's a point of light. Mars is a point of light. There's no contact anymore. You need to bring together very different crews of people. So I just wondered if we could go into, how did the crew for your winter over at Concordia, how was it tested? How did you know you were going to be compatible before you were locked away? I mean, I know the answer is you didn't, of course, but...
No, we certainly didn't, but we did have a lot of training. So of course we had a lot of screening. So before I even got selected, I had to go and have sort of a lot of medical screening and psychological screening before I even had my interview. And then on top of that, we had what's called human behavior performance training, and this is a specialist team which is based at the European Astronaut Centre, and it's all about sort of how to work and live effectively together as part of a crew. And so it's the same training that astronauts have before they go to space, and of course it was a little bit different for our Concordia crew. And a lot of that training as well is sort of based on experiences which crews have had both in Antarctica and in space. And I think it was a lot about sort of learning about people and individuals that you're going to be overwintering with, and how people might react in different situations, and also sort of prepare yourself as well culturally, sort of understanding how people react in those different situations, and also yourself as well. And I think that's really important. And I think a lot of us now can also relate to this with the isolation that we've all experienced sort of in this pandemic as well. I think in some ways, I think it was easier in some respects because when the plane left, like we didn't have a choice about the isolation anymore. And I suppose in a way, also that again relates to the pandemic that we're currently in, because when you don't have a choice, you don't spend the whole time sort of thinking about sort of whether or not you should be in that experience. And it would also be the same psychological pressure that you'd have on a Mars mission as well. I know that technically you probably turn the spaceship around, but I think I think
not
that
really.
that wouldn't be possible, you know, so you wouldn't ever get home again. So so once you're on that sort of trajectory, you are committed, and it's the same as when sort of you leave that last plane to sort of fly away, you sort of commit yourself. And I think psychologically that has a big difference on how you approach the situation, because when you don't have a choice, I think you commit to that experience, then I think that changes very much how you approach it as well, as we all have during the pandemic.
May I ask one question about that? So did you feel any effect on yourself psychologically? I mean, did you become depressed or anything like that? Just temporarily, of course.
Yeah, I mean, of course. So it was a huge, like, psychological and physical challenge for me. I lost a lot of weight, and I did really feel at the end of the sort of 14-month experience, which I had in Antarctica, I really did feel like it was time for me to go home. You know, I sort of felt physically and mentally very much out of shape. I think the big things that we have learned though is, and what we can really do with the research that we have, is all about sort of like learning about sort of that experience, because you don't have the same experience for the whole 14 months. You know, it's very much sort of up and downs, and it's really sort of working out particular time points where people might be more at risk of sort of running into conflict, having problems, isolating themselves, and really putting in sort of countermeasures at those particular points to try and counteract that. And I guess in some ways we sort of naturally did that, sort of even from historically with polar explorers, with having things like midwinter. And I guess it's same to some extent, sort of, you know, back in normal life with like Christmas and things, having that sort of during a sort of more winter period to sort of have something to look forward to. So I think it's about sort of really understanding the crew, understanding the mission that they're going on, and understanding how people react to a longer time course, because you know, one day you might be fine and the next day absolutely not. And it's sort of understanding more about trend and really trying to sort of put in preventative measures rather than waiting until sort of everything is horribly wrong and trying to fix things, and sort of preparing people as best you can. And I think that also in part of it is about selection, sort of choosing who you go down there with. But also I think it's really interesting as well, because you don't necessarily sort of, I remember sort of, you know, it's a bit like Freshers Week when you rock up at like ESO and you sort of see your crew and you're like, you know, everyone's super nice and you're like, oh, I can't imagine like anyone ever being horrible. We're gonna have like the best winter ever. It's gonna be wonderful. Like there's such lovely people. And then like a few weeks later, you know, a few weeks into the mission, you suddenly sort of, you know, these sort of barriers just crack, and suddenly you sort of realize who the different people really are. And I think it's really interesting to sort of see that. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's always a negative thing. You know, sometimes it can be a positive thing and you really sort of get to know the people. And I don't think anyone really like changes, but it just becomes a lot more intense. And I'm sure, again, a lot of us can relate to that, sort of being cooped up in like houses with one or two other people. You really sort of start to really get to know that person in a very different way to how you may have previously.
So a question for both of you in that regard then, is it important to try to maintain circadian rhythms, to have external cues or, you know, meal times together, to use lights to reset, you know, the circadian rhythm? Or do you just let people free run? I mean, I know I have a body clock. I learned this when I was a student, right? I mean, when I was unconstrained by anything except the work I had to do, my body clock was 26 hours long. I would just drift during the week. And I had to reset at the weekend to go and play a volleyball game or something. But, you know, during the week, it would just be 2 hours. So, you know, in the Icelandic context, you know, the seasonal afflictive disorder, whatever it's called, the wintertime problem, or in the summertime when there's no external cues, go to bed now. And then in a research environment where it's like, we want you all to be working as a crew, so you need to be on the same schedule. Sævar, how does that affect people in Iceland? Do people get depressed in the winter and then happy in the summer? I mean, it sounds natural, but...
Yes, there's actually always quite heavy discussions on twilight depression, I guess they would call it, because it's fairly dark in the winter, of course, and people actually do become depressed, and they always look very much forward to summer. 21st of December is probably more of a cause for a celebration at Christmas, because everyone is very excited about the sun finally climbing back up in the sky, and the days are getting longer. So whenever I'm on my social media channels, I see people celebrating every day. Oh, it's bright still, and it's 4 o'clock or something like that. So people do become depressed and much happier in the summer. And for example, in the summer, people play sports throughout the night easily. Midnight sun golfing, for example, or go swimming at midnight or shortly after midnight. So or drink all night long and just celebrate being alive again.
That's just because you're from Scandinavia. That's got nothing to do with it.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But yeah, people do become depressed.
Yeah.
I seem to remember Brenneman, I think it's called. Anyway, fantastic,
Brenneman, yeah.
Fantastic place, and a wonderful way to pass the time, among others. We have a few more questions coming in from people watching, some really, really good ones. And so I want to kind of bring them in if I could. A question for Sævar, actually. And this kind of links back with the environmental concerns, which, we touched on before. And I think it's a valid one. Does Iceland have problems, from your perspective, based on global warming or melting permafrost? Of course, this is something pretty much everybody has some idea what the size of Manhattan is, because every single time people, describe what's happening to glaciers and icebergs and so on, it's on vast scales. I mean, what's your perspective on that, your experience?
Yes, so due to global warming, all the glaciers, or almost all the glaciers, are actually receding, and that makes some steep hills unstable. So there's a chance of increased chances of rock avalanches. And this December, actually, it rained almost as much in 5 days in a small town in the east of Iceland as it does in Reykjavik for a whole year. And that made the hills very unstable, and we actually had avalanches taking place there, because usually it's just snow, but for those 5 days it rained constantly, and there was actually quite a lot of damage. Nobody was killed, fortunately, but the town is still being sort of rescued in a way, because there was so much destruction taking place there. So we feel the effects of global warming, of course, climate change. We basically see it happening live. Whenever we travel to some of these snouts of the glaciers, we can see it recedes every year quite dramatically. There's one type of glacier in the southern part called Sólheimajökull, and I go there pretty much every year, and I've done so for the past 10 years or so, and it's very sort of concerning and dramatic to actually see how fast it's receding. And that makes the hills unstable, so you are in bigger risks of actually with more avalanches, I guess. And it also changes it actually might change how low pressure systems or the ocean currents actually flow up to the country. So there are multiple risks that we have to take into account and look carefully at.
Is there a concern also? I mean, it's one of the things that people tend to forget about is the Gulf Stream. I mean, Iceland is in fact not very icy, and Greenland is not very green. The names are wrong, but Iceland would be completely and totally frozen if it wasn't for the Gulf Stream. And there is this concern about the Gulf Stream potentially turning off at some point. Historically, it's not always there.
Exactly.
Because you work for the Iceland Environmental Agency at the moment, and you've done these TV programs about climate change and other environmental issues. So
yes.
Give us a bit of a feeling about that. It could go one way or it could go the other in Iceland, right?
Yes. So Iceland is barely habitable, as you probably know. It's quite cold here and rainy and dark. But the reason we can actually live here is due to the Gulf Stream, or the North Atlantic current. And there is evidence that it's actually gone weaker for the past few decades or so, and that's not good news for those of us who live this far up north. And that's probably due to the fact that we have some mixing or fresh water coming from, for example, Greenland, that's slowing down this ocean current. And if you look at data that shows you the temperature of the ocean, you can see this bluish blob just south of Iceland, which is quite visible there. So this actually happened about 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, when we had so much fresh water coming from the melting of the glaciers that the current actually stopped for a while, and Iceland just became icy again. And those are the remnants we see today with our glaciers. So we definitely do hope that the Gulf Stream won't weaken much more, because that might affect us quite a lot. It actually might mean that the Iceland will get slightly less warm than the rest of the world, we probably will be able to live here, but we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. There's some really excellent work being done by a professor called Stefan Ramstorff, and if you follow him on Twitter, I highly recommend that you do. He's very knowledgeable of this, and this is his area.
It was actually Stefan I heard it from first some years ago when I was working in Potsdam, and he's at the Geophysical Institute in Potsdam, and I wasn't aware of this issue, and so he has been studying it. Now, Beth, when you did that, you talked about your traverse from the coast all the way up to the plateau. You were also doing environmental testing, sampling of the snowpack, the ice pack there. Tell us a little bit about because Concordia is famous for one particular experiment which is very closely linked to climate change. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the reason Concordia is built where it is because it's on what we call the Dome Charlie Plateau, and it's actually really close to Vostok. So Vostok's our closest neighbour, so it's about 600 k away. And it was built there because it's a really good place for drilling. So for drilling all the ice cores, and it's got the Epica project, which has drilled the sort of oldest ever ice core, which is 800,000 years old. And you can actually go when you're at Concordia. There's like you open up this little, it's like a big Weather Haven tent, and you go in there, and there's like a little metal box that you open up, and then that's actually where they cored sort of that ice core. So you can, although you're not supposed to, sort of drop a little bit of something down there, and you can hear it sort of going all that way down to the ground.
And it's how far down to the bottom there?
It's like 1,200 meters or something around that. But actually the reason that they are built where they're built is because we don't have very much snowfall, so you don't actually have to drill that deep to go a really long way back in time compared to, say, somewhere else where there is so much snowfall, because then you have to sort of obviously drill a lot further to go sort of comparatively in terms of the weather systems and the age. And so also means like on special occasions like New Year's and stuff, you can have like a G&T with ice from different sort of periods of time as well, when they've sort of disposed of the ice cores, which is also quite cool. But also on that note as well, in terms of climate change as well, I think definitely, like before I went to Antarctica, I spent a lot of time up in Greenland, and I also went back to Greenland like after I'd been back from Antarctica. And the thing that I really noticed as well was about the polar bears. And I mean, the first few seasons that I was there, I didn't even see a polar bear. And then definitely, like as time went on and as everything's warmed up a little bit, I think polar bears have become a lot more confident because they're hungry, you know, and they've had to sort of change their behavior. And whereas sort of a while ago, you know, we never saw a polar bear, now because they're so hungry, they're actually sort of approaching groups and things which they've never done before, which I think is really sad to see. Just within quite a short period of time, how that sort of behavior is changing with climate change.
And this is linked, of course, to the Arctic ice melting, where they spend most of their time hunting, and now there's not so much ice, so they come onto the land. I mean,
exactly.
Of course, Svalbard has this problem. Why are there no polar bears in Iceland? I suppose. What's the history there? Well,
so there are mosquitoes. They don't like to live here, and polar bears also don't like to live here. So I wonder why we want to live here anyway. They don't want to. No, but they hardly ever. They actually do come here every now and then. Then they are on icebergs and they swim ashore, and they're really hungry. So whenever there is a polar bear seen in the country, it has to be put down or killed, because it's just too much of a risk to humans living in the area. And that happens occasionally, but there's not much for them to actually eat here or do, I guess.
I guess there's no permanent ice around the island where they would go hunting for seals, which is I suppose the sort of modus operandi.
And humans would probably just kick them out in the end.
Right, but I mean, on the other hand, you know, we're getting into this point now. This is where I remind everybody that Icelanders like to eat certain animals that perhaps the rest of us don't anymore. I mean, there's whales, and of course we could talk about that, but it's also the one which always shocked me when I was there, and you are just dying to get me to eat some of this, because I don't eat mammals, so I'm never going to eat a whale, but I do eat birds, and so you're going to make me eat roast puffin one day, aren't you?
Oh, no, Mark. No,
I haven't. But Sævar says they're very tasty.
Well, Mark is a Hippocratarian. Am I right?
That's great. I'm a Hippocratarian, exactly.
Yes. So
niche.
But puffins are. So I don't eat a lot of puffins. if I go to a restaurant and they serve it, I maybe once in a while have a puffin. But I'm trying to cut back on meat as much as possible due to environmental issues. But puffin is actually quite nice, especially if it's being cooked by a professional chef. And there are quite a large number of birds in the country. It's also part of culture to actually eat it, especially in a small island in the south called Westman Islands. So yeah, it's served in pretty much, well, in many restaurants, I would guess, and it's delicious. So next time
I'm tempted. It must be, everybody says, everything tastes like chicken in the end, but puffin probably doesn't, right? Because they eat fish. So there's kind of fishy chicken. Is that what it is?
Yeah, exactly. And the meat is actually dark, and it has this fishy taste or salty taste. Tastes a little bit like the ocean. So you can, for example, put it into beer, marinate it in a beer, and then fry it, I guess.
It's amazing! Oh my god!
Yes, it's quite good, like a proper beer, like a stout or something like that. Yeah.
I think when I was in Greenland, I spent a bit of time working in the hospital there, and I remember going into the staff room on my first day, and there was like a little sign, and you could buy all the different meats from the local hunter, and one of them was polar bear, and it just had like a little price list, and you could just it was crazy. I was like, wow, really interesting. But I think for that culture, I think it was entirely appropriate. Not really for Western visitors, but for them.
So last time the polar bear was killed here, they didn't recommend that people would actually eat the meat because of risk of some diseases, and they said that the meat wasn't that tasty anyway, so they probably shouldn't do it. But they usually take the skin and what do you call it? They put like I don't know, I don't remember the name of it, but they take the skin off and they it becomes like a statue or something like that.
Yeah, taxidermy. They stuffed
Well, I met a man that had polar bear pants. Very cool. He was like, he was the boss of the village, like the.
Yes. People don't like to eat puffin, I guess, because they are so cute. But I mean, lambs are cute. Definitely.
Yeah. I'm just sorry, Beth. Which way round do you wear polar bear pants? Fur in or fur out?
Fur out. Yeah.
I
suppose there's no rules. There's no rules, but that's what he was doing.
Well, speaking of animals, if I seem to be disappearing, it's because my cat's now sitting in front of my lap. So anyway. There you go.
Some cat pants on.
Well, I mean, to bring it back to the environment and so on. I suppose, while I'm by no means an expert, I mean, anyone who watches, Attenborough documentaries, whatever else, knows that many of these environments, for instance, the poles, just like deserts, they are in fact anything but barren. They are fragile ecosystems, and in many ways, the most sensitive to environmental change. And I suppose like so much of what we do on Space Rocks, we're engaging with many subjects to do with fundamentally space exploration. It always seems to loop back to questions about the Earth and the fragility of our environment, which is such a an important topic, I think, to always do. And Mark, I mean, I suppose I wonder about your thoughts, because isn't it interesting how no matter where we go with Uplink, it does always seem to kind of connect back with this fundamental issue, which is that staggeringly in our own lifetimes, we're witnessing drastic change, and of course the consequence of that, you would hope, is drastic political action as well.
Yeah, well, completely. I mean, I don't know if we've announced it here, but we're getting a new director general at ESA. So Jan Werner is retiring at the end of this month, February. And the new director general coming is Josef Aschbacher, who is the current director of Earth observation. And of course, we have one of the biggest fleets of Earth observation satellites looking down at the Earth, monitoring the wind, the ice, the carbon dioxide, providing synoptic cover. So, Sævar can go and look at a glacier and say it's moving backwards. Beth can see the same changes. But how do you measure that day to day to day? And of course, in some places, glaciers are actually growing. And some people say, oh, that's, there's no climate change. Look, that glacier is growing. But if you can look at it globally and say, well, that's because there's a shift in the streams of water from one place to the other. We talk about climate change. Overall, the globe is warming, but in some places it's going to get colder. Most places can get warmer. So I think that space in that regard has that rather strange place for people. It's partly escapism. It's this idea the Earth seems to be, almost mundane or a little bit damaged. Let's go somewhere else. Let's escape. But we know that Mars is so utterly foul as a place, for example. You might go there to explore, but you really, really don't want to live there. Nothing we do to the Earth, as bad as it ever gets, will be as bad as Mars is. I'm sorry, it's so it is important, I think, that we reflect on these looking outwards, but use that as a way of saying this place is pretty unique and pretty special, and we're built for it. How can we preserve it whilst retaining perspective? There's 8 billion people on this planet nearly, and the pandemic is in some ways an outcome of that, right? I mean, all of these things interplay together. The fact that we can fly around the world in 24 hours and we can transmit diseases and we can transmit knowledge as well. We can help create vaccines in unprecedented timescales. So I wanted to jump off there because, Beth, you mentioned something earlier on about this with respect. We talked about coronavirus right at the beginning, but the way that you're dealing with it in the hospitals actually does have some link to the sorts of things you'll have to do in space, telemedicine and remote techniques. Tell us a little bit about how that is part of the business now in medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ESO have been very proactive in that respect. So before the pandemic even started, I was part of a specialist working group because of ESO, and ESO is heavily involved in it, working with like United Nations, WHO, looking at how they can address all of the sustainable development goals using space technology, and one of which is healthcare, or sort of good health and well-being, SDG 3. And a lot of the discussions that we're having pre-pandemic was all about sort of how can we use Earth observation. So, for example, how can we use that data that you're talking about? So, for example, to predict how mosquito populations might be moving by looking at sort of land, water, distribution and climate, and how that's changing and temperature changing. And then from that, being able to predict which areas might be more or less risk of having sort of vector-borne diseases with mosquitoes, and trying to put in preventative measures for those communities as well. And also using telemedicine, which has now become sort of just a massive part of our day-to-day lives. And just a couple of years ago, that was all stuff that we were talking about, and it sort of seemed so futuristic. And then with the pandemic, it's all suddenly just had to be used. And I've really noticed how now space technology has become a much bigger part of my day-to-day life than it ever has before. Sort of a few years ago, actually we still do have, doctors traditionally have, the bleep, which is like very much from the 60s and so sort of antiquated in terms of technology. But then, so I always used to sort of, think that there's such a big disparity between the technology we have and what we actually use sort of on the shop floor, as it were, and sort of the medical sense. But I think that's actually changed a lot over the last 12 months. And I think that we really can see the benefits of space technology sort of in the workplace, really. So a lot of my patients are now using telecommunications to be in touch with families and loved ones with FaceTime and things like that, which just wasn't something that we were doing before. And it's had massive effect because we never needed it before. Before this time, we've always been able to have families and friends coming in, of course, to sort of patients at end of life care. And now it really is only sort of 2 family members right at the end of life that we're even allowing, which is obviously devastating for families. But this satellite technology really has improved our ability to sort of try and in some ways keep people connected with friends and family back home, which I think has been really useful. And not only that, but also sort of disease mapping and disease tracking. I know that Johns Hopkins had a really useful map right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we really were using that clinically to sort of work out sort of risk of patients and how likely they were or were not to have had COVID based on the way that the disease was progressing, and that was being updated real time, which is incredible, really. But we had that resource, and that's all sort of thanks to space tech as well. And also the other big thing, which I hadn't really considered, was all about sort of education. Because, we never, certainly I ever experienced sort of a new disease in such a way. And we all had to learn about it. I've never sort of donned and doffed PPE equipment and things like that. And initially it's just alien, and we had to learn it over a number of weeks at a time when you're not able to have big conferences and big events where doctors are able to, or healthcare professionals are able to come together and discuss things. And I was able to sort of log into conferences speaking to doctors in Italy right at the beginning of the outbreak and really learn from their experiences to help prepare us as units and groups sort of to really sort of learn from those experiences really real time without the need to travel, which I think was a really unique way of sort of using the technology, and really I think did help in terms of our response to the pandemic and sort of modelling as well. So I think it's been really exciting to see how space tech really has been used in this area in a sort of really unique way.
So let me pick up on that. So just one anecdote, which sort of a precursor technology, I think, which slightly lighter perhaps. Well, maybe not, but is this one in Iceland, where with such a small community, if you go out to a bar and you meet somebody,
You're talking about Tinder, Mark?
No, not that at all. In fact, quite the opposite, I think, right? The point is, Sævar, you better know that the person you're chatting up over the bar, you're not actually related to. So there is an app on your phone, right, where you can actually dial in each other's names and figure out, hey, you're my first cousin. Thanks very much. Bye.
Well, I don't happen to have that app on here because I'd just take the risk. No, in a way.
But it is true, right? It's not. This is an issue in a relatively small
country.
That's true. There is this website called Icelander's Book, and it's actually available as an app as well, that you can just figure out the name of the person you're talking to and figure out how you are related, because everyone here is related. We all have the same great something grandfather that was killed. His head was chopped off or killed, basically, in the year 1550. And every Icelander can trace their ancestry back to him. So we're all related. But my girlfriend, we actually, when I started seeing my girlfriend now, she actually looked it up and saw that we were not that related, so it was fine.
But so that, I mean, it's sort of a fascinating thing, right? Because it's another extension of the technology, which on one hand is intrusive because it means you have to enter personal details, but it can also be something which is helpful because it allows you to not get into the trouble of, genetically.
Yes. What stage would you be doing this, Mark? Is this like first date territory, or are we like a couple of dates down that you would start inputting your data?
From my side, which is kind of a question is that. I think I'll leave that to you and Sævar to answer. But I was interested in jumping off there because how has Iceland dealt with this? Iceland is in some ways broadly the Northern Hemisphere's New Zealand, let's say, right? I mean, It's a place with, yes, you rely on lots of tourists coming in. It's not quite the same financial hub that London might be. Iceland's had a different experience.
That's true. So basically, and fortunately, our politicians just listen to the scientists. So whenever we have some new developments, it's usually doctors or someone from the authorities, but there are hardly ever politicians on stage talking about what we are actually doing and the next steps. So today there were no infections or being reported, I guess. And currently we seem to have everything under control. Unfortunately, some people have died because of this. I think there are about 20 something. I don't remember exactly the number, but by listening to the scientists, we've done some pretty decent job. We have hardly had to close anything for an extended period of time, except for in the beginning when everything almost was shut, but we haven't had any lockdowns. Really, the schools have been open, and we can go to coffee shops and go to restaurants, go shopping. We have to wear masks, of course.
Oh, so jealous.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, everything seems to be. It's quite okay, I guess. But as long as you're not in the tourist industry, then you're pretty well.
Well, that was going to say. I mean, it's a big component of the Icelandic economy, and it's a big component of what you do, bringing tourists. You didn't mention the hotel where you work, Hotel Ranga on the outskirts. Well, actually, quite some way from Reykjavik, in very dark area, bringing tourists. So, obviously, this has to end at some point. So you can contain the virus, but you want people back at some point. So, how does that gonna?
Absolutely do. So nowadays, people are being vaccinated. It's not happening as fast as we hoped it would be, but I guess that's the same problem everywhere. So we just have to be patient, I guess. So if people want to come here, all arriving passengers who want to stay in the country have to undergo 2 tests when they arrive in the country and then wait 5 days in quarantine for retesting. And if the second test is negative, you are free to roam around wherever you want to go. But currently there are hardly any tourists, but we cannot wait for them to come back because that's a very big part of our economy. For example, in my case, most of the things I did was actually shut down or stopped for a period. And it has had financial effect, of course, but at least I have my health and I'm pretty good. So no bad things have happened to me fortunately, but that's not the same for everyone, of course.
No, and I think that's the thing that we all have to remember as well, is that just how it's affecting people psychologically as well, because I think I've probably seen almost as many people die of suicide than I have of COVID as well. So I think it's really a difficult time for a lot of people, and we mustn't forget that as well.
Yes, so physically and mentally, of course, it's been really hard because people haven't been able to go to the gyms, for example, which is a big part of living here because, well, to be fair, the weather isn't always nice for doing some physical activity outside. So people's physical health and mental health has taken a dive, but the gyms are being reopened now, so people can start to go to their normal pace in life, fortunately.
Well, I suppose as with so many uplinks, as it began with Beth, I guess 36 episodes ago, we leave the Earth momentarily, and then we return to it, and I suppose there's so much about this situation, that we have, learned hard lessons from, and so on. But I guess it also reminds us just how fragile our species are, how fragile our environment is, and just how important it is, to preserve it. I mean, I wondered if this is a final thought, that's a good one to end on. And Mark, I do think that this highlights the need for a future episode on space dating, and because clearly that's a whole different kettle of fish right there.
Well, I'm not going to ask. I'm not. Did we talk last time about Beth and her midwinter celebration and what that did in Antarctica? Come on, tell us that story. It's a good one, right?
Actually, you're lying to you, Mark.
Come on, you talk. All right. Well, so as you say, there's the midwinter celebration in Antarctica. And you thought, well, it's a time for a celebration, so you put on your party dress, and apparently, became the object of French and Italian men squaring off. Is that not the case?
It's just isolation. That's it.
It was just. Anyway. It was, what happens in Antarctica stays in Antarctica. Right?
Absolutely, minus 300 club.
Oh yeah, tell us about that one. Yeah.
On that note.
Yeah. But no, to be a bit more serious, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the one thing we have learned since the first uplink is the only way we will survive in the near term, the medium term, or the longer term is if we talk to each other and try to share these experiences, and not just scientists talking to scientists, but musicians, artists, giving us the psychological and the cultural experience, because people are not just robots who will follow the rules. We know that. I was when you said Sævar, the French protest, I was thinking at some point when Beth said something about everybody's locked down there, did the French all go out and march around Concordia and leave the Italians inside? No. So but this idea that there's just one route. We've seen that. We've experienced that the last 12 months in spades. We can all scream and say the science says this, but people aren't just robots. People have other parts to their lives. Yeah. And balancing that, I don't think we found the answer yet. We really haven't. We're not out of this thing yet. We still have a lot to learn. And if space rocks at some tiny fraction can help create dialogue. So thank you both for coming on again this evening and giving us those insights and experiences.
Yeah, no, and thanks very much, Mark and Alex, for organising all of these. I know how much work it is, and thank you. And I can't wait for the next live one.
Us too.
Yeah. We do have a tradition before you go. Mark, it's always your turn to do this.
I don't know if we did this with the first episode, but since then we've come up with this thing. So we have a crazy tradition that we have a hand signal, which is space, which is the Vulcan salute, and rocks, which is the horns. Space rocks, So come on, Beth. Now you're going to be not going to be one of those
I'm
people
used
that
to
can't
doing
do
more
that.
like that.
No, that's hang loose. That's Hawaii. So the Vulcan salute. You can do it how you like. It's okay. Well, of course, you
My
throw the.
phone got so upset then. Just doing that. Hang on, I've got to do it then.
We've got to do it because
Hang
it is the obligatory screenshot at the end of every episode.
Hang on, let me just get it.
Vulcan salute. There you go.
I'm doing too much hang loose. My fingers.
Yeah, exactly. The rocks. You know, you are a heavy metal chick underneath. We know
there we
that.
go. Okay, hang on.
All right, you got it. You got it now. One more time. Perfect.
All right, both. Thank you so much
with the Instagram pout as well. Perfect. You are the social media bunny of my day.
Wonderful to see you both. Thanks so much again, and keep in touch. We'll hopefully see you again very soon.
Thanks very much. Bye, Sævar. Bye, Beth. See you soon. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye, guys. Bye.
Very good. Okay, then. Well, Mark, we've got, one more episode down, and what a wonderful blast from the past having Beth back, because she kicked it all off with us a little while ago. And, to make a new friend in Sævar, is super exciting. And we'll have to invite him back again, because there's just so much about Iceland that fascinates. And there's so much about it that educates as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had the backdrop earlier on with the flat plateau, pretty close to the Blue Lagoon actually, which is out there by the airport, just that little corner of Iceland. And it's actually where we filmed the famous Ambition film for the Rosetta mission. So this sort of barren new landscape with no life on it. We used that piece of lava-strewn plateau to stand in for that. But yeah, Iceland is an absolutely astonishing place, partly because of the landscape, but partly because of the history and that story about isolation and small groups of people. And we forget, we live in cities of millions, that there's an entire country, huge country, with just 300,000 people in it, and it's one of my favorite places on the earth, I have to say. And Sævar is a fantastic ambassador for the country as well. He is the most famous astronomer in Iceland, does a lot of TV and outreach, and has really helped bring astronomy into Iceland as well. Because as he says, it's not something you associate with Iceland as such, but it's they have a unique view on the northern sky.
A unique view, and he's a great voice for it all as well. So nice I'm back. I suppose we're gonna be back next week, just similar time, same day, certainly. I mean, anything we can foreshadow about where we're going, or shall we keep it a secret just for a moment longer?
Well, we're not, we're amongst friends. We don't have it completely locked down, but we hope to be talking to a couple of people in a completely different sphere, in the sphere where data meets design, design meets culture, meets science. We've talked a little bit about the environment we live in, but also it's the environments we create. If we go to Mars or go back to the moon, do you really want to live in a sterile box, or how do you create an environment which is more suited to humans? And that's not just the environment, the physical environment, but it's the extended environment, because we all live in a digital world today. So yeah, let's hope that those we can figure the timing out with the guests for next week, look forward to being back on Uplink with you in a week's time, Alex.
Indeed, as ever, Mark, an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much to everyone who watched, and we'll catch you very soon indeed.
Bye bye, everybody.